Okay, good morning. It is Monday the 31st of October, and this is a bit of a retrospective vlog. I haven't been uploading as often as I have been recently because, frankly, I've not been doing much. So today I want to talk about what I was doing yesterday and a little bit about what I've been doing over the last couple of months. Now, many of you will have heard of something called Dungeons and Dragons. If you grew up in the 80s, or maybe the mid to late 70s, you will know very much about Dungeons and Dragons. And Dungeons and Dragons started off as a role-playing game.
Hey, look! A Dungeons and Dragons ride! Wow, neat!
Give me a break.
I don't like this!
Whoa! What's happening? I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
But ultimately, Dungeons and Dragons is a board game played with a group of people. Okay, let's give you some context. You've probably heard of a board game called Cluedo, when you play a little character that you move around the board and you have to solve a mystery. Professor Plum, Colonel Mustard, Miss White, the maid, things like that. And you've got a little plastic figure, you move it around the board and you go into the different rooms and you get to search the room, you pick up certain cards, and by process of elimination you have to work out who killed the guest. Now, Dungeons & Dragons works on a very similar principle, but you've got much more scope in what you do. The board is either not there or entirely flexible, and the entire game is being run by the Dungeon Master or the Games Master. And he's responsible for weaving a story around which your characters take part. Now, as a player, you play a character. I've got a character sheet here. Basically, you've got your character's abilities here. So, are you playing an elf? Are you playing a dwarf? Are you playing a human warrior or a mage, a magic user? There's dozens of different types of characters you can play. You're limited by your imagination only. On the character sheet, you list your your character's skills, his strength, his agility. Is he particularly smart? And based on these skills, you then go out and adventure. You have other things like the types of weapons that he uses, the types of armor that he carries, and if he's a magic user, does he have any spells, as well as other things that the character may carry through the adventure. Things like some rope, maybe a herbal kit, healing potions. Ultimately, though, you play your character. So whatever character you create, whether it's something from the Lord of the Rings franchise or something from the pure Dungeons and Dragons universe, you create a character within the framework of the game. And Dungeons & Dragons is all about a framework of rules. There are quite a lot of manuals that come with the Dungeons & Dragons system, but in the manuals you'll have details of what you can do as a character. So if you're a new player or a new character, you've just set out on your life of adventuring, you're probably going to be something like level 1. You're not going to be very strong, you're not going to have much health, you're not going to have much in the way of abilities. But as you progress through your story, your character levels up. If you've played computer games like Final Fantasy or Skyrim, that kind of concept will be very familiar to you. Now, within the framework of rules, it also dictates what you can do and how you do it. Typically with Dungeons & Dragons, the Games Master will lay out a scenario. For example, you are in a tavern, you're drinking, most games start in taverns. You're having a drink with a couple of friends and a man bursts in the door. He looks like he's been attacked. What do you want to do? So the Dungeon Master will put out that scenario, and as a group of players you have to decide what you're going to do. Ideally you stay in character, you can put on silly voices if you wish, you can discuss it amongst yourselves, but you can choose. And that's the biggest departure from the kind of computer games that we're used to in modern times, where you're funneled along a very narrow path. Dungeons & Dragons, you can do absolutely anything you want, as long as the Games Master, the GM, the Dungeon Master is happy with that choice. So if you decide that you want to put on a party hat, and you whip out a party hat and put it on to distract the other people in the bar while your friends go over there and pick his pockets, you can do that. Now, whatever decision you make, you're going to be having to choose an outcome. And those outcomes are normally dictated by these very odd-looking polyhedral dice. And this is what Dungeons & Dragons have always been famous for. The most commonly used dice is going to be your D20. So if I say I want to attempt to heal the character, the Dungeon Master would say, right, roll your D20 against your magical ability. Based on the outcome of this dice, the Dungeon Master would say, right, you've successfully healed them, roll a D6, normal 6-sided dice, to show how many hit points he gets back. The other things the manuals will go through is the list of creatures. There is a book called the Monster Manual, which goes through all the different types of monsters you can introduce into your adventure. Maybe it's a couple of wolves that attack our party when they're travelling between towns. Maybe it's a goblin or an orc, which, again, if you watched Lord of the Rings movies, you'll be familiar with. Maybe it's something far more exotic, like a multi-headed dragon, or some kind of sea kraken that's attacking you during a sea voyage. Those rule books will state the stats of the monster. How many hit points does it have? How good is its armor? What kind of special attacks can it do? And that's basically what Dungeons and Dragons is. It's a group of friends or colleagues or just random strangers sitting around a table taking part in an interactive storytelling experience. So as a kid, we didn't have all that fancy stuff. All we had was pencil and paper, maybe a couple of dice if we had some money to spare, and the Dungeons and Dragons rulebooks. And from that, you get to craft the adventure. Personally, I'm not a particularly dice-heavy, rules-heavy kind of person. What I would prefer to do is get the players involved in the story. Because I've been in the process of moving back up north for some time now, I've been doing a lot of driving backwards and forwards from here to London, enough so that it killed my old car. But on those drives, there's only so much music you can listen to, and a 5-hour drive is still a 5-hour drive. So trying to keep yourself entertained, but more importantly, trying to keep myself awake as I'm driving is a challenge sometimes. So what I've started doing is listening to audiobooks. Now, one of the new wave of geek culture books that has come out recently is a book by the name of Ready Player One, written by Ernest Cline. Anyway, long story short, the audiobook was narrated by Will Wheaton, Wesley Crusher from the Star Trek TNG fame. And Will Wheaton, not only do we see him on things like The Big Bang Theory, but he's very active on the internet. Very big YouTuber, and he's himself is a games master playing Dungeons and Dragons. Now, one of the things that pops up in that audiobook is obviously Dungeons and Dragons. The book is a celebration of 80s culture. Music, technology of the 80s, computer games predominantly, and D&D plays a small part in the story. So I thought, well, D&D is something that you do with a group of people. They don't necessarily have to be friends, they can be total strangers for all you know. As long as you're sharing the adventure, you're cooperating, you're collaborating, and you're all taking part in the story. So I decided to pop along to Forbidden Planet, where they have a D&D meet every Wednesday. Went along as a completely new player, told them that I haven't played for over 25 years, and they welcomed me in quite quickly, threw me into a group, and some of the old skills that I had, the ability to play a character, the ability to think about what your character would do rather than what you would do, a lot of that came back pretty quickly. And it really sucked me into the game and made me realise why I loved all this adventure role-playing games in the first place. So, simple question of how did all this get started? Well, back when I was a kid, I think I was probably about 13 or 14, a friend of mine introduced me to the concept of role-playing games. He was a Dungeons & Dragons player himself, but he also played a variety of other systems. And we started by just having like a storytelling session, walking back from school. So it'd be like a 25-30 minute walk. And as we'd be walking, he'd be spinning a story, and giving me the idea of making choices. It didn't involve any dice, we were walking on the way home. But that concept of storytelling and focus on the storytelling is where all this began.